Have you ever required your child to apologize? Let's imagine a scenario of you're at the playground with your child and they're playing with another child and something happened. Somehow the other child got hurt and maybe they got sand in the eyes or got injured in some way, and maybe your child did it. So you run to that situation and you say to your child, "You need to apologize. Go say you're sorry." Has that ever happened? Sometimes it can sound like this. The child walks over to the injured child and says, "Sorry," and then moves on quickly. Have you ever seen that? Maybe that's even happened in your own home where you have required your child to go to the person who's been injured or something unfair happened, and you require them to go and say that familiar phrase of sorry or "I'm sorry," and then move on. Oftentimes when we require it, that's exactly what it is. It's a requirement from the adult, and the child is completing that task because it was a requirement. It is not coming from within. It is not teaching that child to truly apologize for their mistake. So instead of requiring sorry, what we need to do is teach it. And the first way we teach our children to apologize is we model it for them. When we make mistakes, we apologize. We use that wonderful familiar phrase, "I'm sorry," and we say it with sincerity. And you may be thinking, "But I'm an adult. I really don't make a lot of mistakes." Actually, we do. We make mistakes all the time. So it isn't if we make mistakes. What I like to say is it's when we make mistakes. Maybe we were too firm with our child, or maybe we raised our voice. Whatever it is, when we show up to them and we apologize for our mistake and our tone was too firm, or we raised our voice and we apologize for that and we own that mistake, that's how we're teaching sorry. Now let's go back to the example of at the playground with another child who isn't yours. And instead of going over and that injured child let's pretend that child was injured by your child, instead of arriving to that situation and requiring your child to go over and say they're sorry, instead of doing that, what we can do in this moment is a very important teaching moment. You can guide this teaching moment with your child. First, show up to the child who's been injured and make sure they're okay. Make sure that they are attended to. Then, if your child's still standing there, or maybe they're not, and you need to help bring them back, you can bring them back to that child. And at that point, instead of requiring, you're going to give your child an open-ended question. You may even use a statement first and say, "Oh, look at his face. He is so sad." Now we're going to open-ended, give a question, and involve the child in the process by saying, "What do you think you could do?" Instead of tell them you're sorry. Instead of requiring it, you're going to give that open-ended question. And the reason we give an open-ended question and involve them is because they literally get to be part of the process. And when they're part of the solving process and part of the solution, they own it more. It comes from a more sincere place because it can be their idea. So if you were to say, "Look at him, he's so sad. He didn't like it when you did that. What do you think you could do?" And oftentimes the child will say, "Well, I could say I'm sorry," and that idea came from them rather than from the big person or the adult or the parent. So it's important that it comes from them. And let's say they did that. "Well, I could tell them I'm sorry." Great idea. I think that is a really good idea. And then oftentimes as you hear that child apologize, it comes from a different place. Instead of a requirement, it came from within. So it's important to guide that as the parent, to guide the apology instead of require it. It's important to teach it. We teach it through modeling it ourselves, and we teach it by guiding in the moment. Let's go over some different scenarios. Let's say that they may not say, "Well, I could tell them I'm sorry," or they could say, "I've had this happen before in my own home with my own children when I hand back the problem and I say, 'What do you think you could do?' And I've had kids say, 'I could write them a note,' or 'I could draw them a picture.'" All great ideas. And if you have a child who says, "I don't know what I could do," at that point, you're still guiding the situation. You could offer a menu of options. You could say things like, "Well, you could write him a letter. Maybe you could draw him a picture, make them a cool figurine or a cool thing with Legos. You could say you're sorry. Like, you can give this as an option rather than a requirement. So you can give them a list of ideas if that's needed. But oftentimes kids will think of the idea on their own. Let me give you an example of this in my own home. So my oldest children at the time were probably like 6 and 4, and they were watching PBS Kids cartoons one afternoon. And I think I was upstairs, possibly taking a nap. And my son was sitting on the back of the couch, and my daughter was sitting on the couch. So he was sitting behind her. And as he started to lose his balance, he rolled off and he rolled down her back, which pulled her hair as he was falling down the couch. And let me just tell you, this was not intentional. This is not an aggressive child. It was an accident. But my daughter didn't realize that, so she turned around and started throwing punches. And all of a sudden, from upstairs, I can hear these two non-aggressive children being very aggressive and crying and yelling. And I ran down and I figured out the situation, and I heard this story, and we were able to have a conversation at that point. And we talked about how sometimes things are unintentional and how some things are intentional. It was unintentional that it pulled your hair when he fell down the couch, but it is intentional to throw those punches. So once we established that and we talked about what had happened, I asked my daughter, "What do you think you could do?" That's all I said. I didn't say, "Tell him you're sorry that you hit him." I did not require it. All I said is, "What do you think you could do?" I left it open-ended to her. And let me tell you, she came up with something so much better than I could have even thought of. She said, "Well, maybe I could make his bed for him tomorrow." I thought that was so great. And I told her, "What a great idea." "Yes, I love that idea. That seems like a great way." I love this because she thought of a way to serve him. This didn't come from mom. Wasn't my idea. It was her own individual idea. Now, I realized she would probably need help the next morning remembering to do that, so I did remind her, and she did it, and she did it with a great attitude. So sometimes when we hand that to the child and we involve them in learning how to apologize, it's going to look differently. It may be with words, it may be through service, it may be through a note or a drawing, but helping them to truly understand that they can own their apology rather than requiring it. There's so much more power in helping them be part of the process and the solution rather than just requiring those words and they move on with life and didn't really feel the emotion of it. So I want you to think about that for a minute. If we can teach our kids to truly apologize, to own when they've messed up, do you think that's going to benefit them in their childhood? Absolutely. Do you think that's going to benefit them when they're teenagers? Absolutely. Do you think that's going to benefit them when they're adults and in various relationships in their lives, work relationships or a relationship with a spouse and family relationships? Yes, indeed, it will help their lives if they can learn to own their mistake and truly apologize when they mess up. Not because they were required to, but because it came from within and they know that they can apologize and know how that feels. So rather than requiring your child to say, "I'm sorry," go ahead and guide that process and teach them how to say sorry by apologizing when you mess up, making sure that you sincerely apologize, and then guiding that conversation when there is an issue. You've got this. You can guide your child in their apologies.